In this component of the educational program, like to make a few comments about some work we've done in Ghana, which I think translates into some of the questions you've got here in Malawi and how you might be able to address some of those issues. So I'm going to present some information to you today. And a couple of things when it comes to weed management. We know that we need to protect groundnut yield. Many times we can gain financial return, a positive financial return, if we do extra weeding. That can have a huge impact, and our timing is important. One of our big questions is, what can we do to increase the efficiency of our system? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some herbicide work that was done in Ghana. And I know some of that is being done here in Malawi as well. So again, as many of you well know how important weeding is. These are just some images from Malawi a year or so ago with some of the weeds that are coming in, and we've already had some yield loss from the weed interference by the time you get to this point. So early weeding and multiple weedings are what's very important, and the approach you make to that depends on the resources you have available. This is one set of data from the U.S. that I wanted to present that I think does demonstrate how important the frequency of weeding is, and also the timing of weeding. And when I say weeding here, this is the use of herbicides. You could do something very similar with hand removal, although it's not as hand removal is much slower, and in some cases it's very efficient and very complete, but it certainly requires a lot of labor. So in this particular example here, I'm showing different combinations or sequences of weeding and different timings. So for example, when we didn't do anything, if you look at no weed control at all, we had, as you can imagine, very poor weed control, and we only had about 25% of our maximum yield. And when I say maximum yield, that's compared to the level of complete weed control that we had by a certain point in time with the more intensive herbicide programs. If we only had one weeding at 2 weeks after planting, you'll see that we picked up about 30% weed control towards the end of the season, and we got about 50% of our yield potential. If we decided to only have one weed control operation at 6 weeks after planting, that was certainly better than one at 2 weeks. Again, many of the weeds had come up, and we were approaching 70% weed control, and we were getting about 70% of our yield. When we started having combinations of 2 weeks and then coming right back at 4 weeks, which that's a fairly short interval, we approached 95% weed control by the end of the season, and we had about 70% of our yield. When we had 4 and 6, so we timed that a little bit later on, that's when we again that's what I just talked about. But when we had 4 and 6, so we delayed things a bit. We again had almost complete weed control, but our yields approached 90% of the maximum. And when we had weed control at 2, 4, and 6, so a more intensive program, that's when we maximized our weed control, and we also maximized our yield. So this was using herbicides at those timings. If you have access to herbicides, that can be an efficient way to do this, but the frequency is important, almost as important as the timing of when you have that frequency. We often refer to the timing of weed management needing to occur within the first 4 to 6 weeks after planting for peanuts, and that's true for a lot of our crops. If we can do that at that point in time, the critical weed-free period, we can often maximize our yields. Now this is a data set from Ghana, which is an attempt to look at herbicide use compared to hand labor. And in this particular example, where we had no weed control, if you look at our no weed control implemented, we had about 20% of our maximum yield, very similar to what we saw in the U.S. example a minute ago. Our financial returns were very low. Where we used just a pre-emergence herbicide, we increased our financial returns and our yield somewhat. Not great, but it gave us some suppression of weeds early. And again, our labor cost, this is the number of 6-hour days. When we used a post-emergence herbicide only, one application, again, we had some labor costs there. About a half a day, I think, is what that turned out to be per hectare. These are all per hectare. And we had about almost 80% of our yield and our financial return, maximum financial return, was observed with that one post-emergent spray. From a hand weeding standpoint, we got complete weed control with that program. I think in that system they had 2 well-timed hand weedings. The financial return was about 85% of the maximum. Part of that was the labor involved in the hand weeding. And then if you look at the number of 6-hour days that were required for that, that was about 40 6-hour days to achieve that amount of weed control in those particular fields. Where we had a pre-herbicide and hand weeding, you can see that we reduced the amount of, or the number of days that were required, but we did maximize our yield and our net returns, our financial return. When we had post and hand weeding, we had a little bit more hand weeding that was necessary here, but we came very close to maximizing our yield and our financial return. And the whole point of this is to indicate that depending on the labor you have, if you can make one application of a herbicide, and in this case, maybe the post-emergence herbicide is the most effective way to go early in the season after the weeds are up, you can approach, especially if it's supplemented with hand weeding, you can approach or have your maximum yields and maximum financial returns, and you can really cut back on the labor you have. So those are some things to think about as we move forward and try to be efficient in our production systems. We've talked about this before, but one of the questions is how can we increase yield, returns, and improve food safety with production practices? So this is another example from Ghana where we looked at groundnut yield, financial return, aflatoxin contamination, and then the quality of kernels that could have been entered the marketplace at some period after storage. And I made some print screens from some articles that we've prepared. And so there's a lot of words on some of these slides, but I'm going to get to the key point here as I go through these. We had 6 experiments in Ghana over a period of years, 2016 to 17, quite a bit of aflatoxin. If you look at the total after storage, it always starts out relatively low. But when we had the farmer practice, and that was just what the farmer traditionally did, the improved practice was an additional hand weeding, the use of a local soap to suppress aphids, which could have a minor suppression of rosette, and then we put some calcium at pegging. So this was our package, and we had higher yields. We went from 1,800 to 2,200 kilograms per hectare. Even though those numbers are small, there was a statistical difference in the amount of aflatoxin coming out of the field. When you looked at those treatments, the in-season practice and then the drying method, which was the improved method here, was drying on a tarp. In this area of Ghana, even during harvest, you can get some additional rains, and the ability to move those tarps out and then cover them up and so forth and get them off the ground we felt like was an important approach, and that did show that. So the farmer, if the normal practice of the farmer in the field and then drying on the ground, 150 micrograms per kilogram after the drying step. When we dried on the tarp, protected, that went down to 33. If you just looked at the approved system in the field and then the normal drying on the ground, there was a reduction in aflatoxin after drying, 57. But if you had both improved steps at in-season and drying, we were down to about 9. So there was a huge improvement compared to what the farmer was doing immediately after drying and then prior to going into storage. And this is certainly a very busy slide, but let me just point out the highlights here. The whole goal of this was to show that if you have a suite of options to do. Now, in other words, if a farmer can decide to do something improved at the in-season step, if it's easier to do something at the drying step from an improvement, or if you can improve things by storage, you can have an impact. So sort of the answer is, it's almost like do something that you can afford. If you can do two things that you can afford, that really makes an impact. So if you look at just the farmer practice, at the in-season step, during the cycle, during the season, drying, and then storage, the top line, you'll see we had 832 micrograms per kilogram after 4 months of storage. So that's a huge health risk and a huge issue. If you go all the way down to the improved step, all the way across, for each one of those, 18, so we reduced that substantially. And then let's just say that you use the farmer technique in the field, but then you did the 2 improved steps at drying and storage. That was a 49, so a huge reduction there. But it could be that you couldn't afford, for example, maybe the storage, so you had the improved in season, you had the improved at drying, but then you had the farmer. This is the second line from the bottom. That's 142. So this gives you an idea of how each of these incremental steps can reduce aflatoxin. If you look at the next column where it's good kernels, it's tied very closely to the good kernels. So where the aflatoxin tends to be is in the bad kernels. So if you were to sort those out at the end of the day and look at the yield of good kernels, if you look at the improved steps all the way across, 95% of what was in there after 4 months of storage were good kernels, and that was about 1,100 kilograms per hectare of good kernels that could enter the market. And if you remember, our yields were around, we averaged over some of our treatments, but we were around 2,000 kilograms per hectare. So we really, what we harvested, we were able to sell after 4 months of a complete package of improvement in the market. The farmer, if you sorted before you sold, and the farmer did all 3 of the normal steps, that was only about 680. So again, you are able to improve not only your gross yield coming out of the field with some of those farmer practices in this growing cycle, but at the end of the day, the good kernels that would enter the market would be improved too with those steps. And then we looked at the net return, the financial return that farmer might receive after 4 months of storage based on those practices. And I'm going to look at plot data adjusted to the national average. A lot of times in our research plots, the actual yields tend to be higher than what you might see out in the broader community, and that's just because we have small plots. We pick good areas, uniform areas, and that often will translate into higher yields in our plot work, so we realize that. But on the financial returns, what you'll see is if you had the improved steps all the way across at the very bottom, 484 kilograms per hectare. In fact, what looked the best, or just numerically the best, if you'll go up to where we had the farmer in season, the improved at drying, the improved in storage, that's where we had our highest number, 522. And from the farmer standpoint, if you look at the financial return of in-season farmer drying, and in-season farmer storage, we had our lowest number of 206. But again, the whole goal of this study was to give us an idea of where the major issues are with aflatoxin contamination and how we can move forward and implement 1 or 2 or maybe 3 strategies at each step in the supply chain in the village before we go to market. We also did some work in northern Ghana. Very similar studies. Our treatments were a little bit different, and I've just highlighted a few things at the very top. If you had normal farmer practice, about 1,000 kilograms per hectare, the improved practice with just a fertilizer blend plus our weed control, additional weed control, and our suppression of aphids, we went up to 2,800. And then if we had the improved practice of an additional weeding, local subs for suppression of aphids and rosette, that was only 2,100. The haulm yield is very important for livestock in Ghana, and then the kernel quality was improved with the fertilizer, either as a fertilizer blend commercially available or the oyster shells. And then the financial return on those investments was substantial. $451 for the farmer, $1,200 for when you just had the additional weeding, local soaps, and the fertilizer. And then with the oyster shells, which are a calcium source, there was an improvement there as well, not quite as good as the commercial blend. The rest of that table has some of the pest damage and so forth that we see. There was a slight decrease in aflatoxin contamination coming out of when we had the fertilizer blend and oyster cells. That's at the very bottom. So again, low numbers, but if you have enough replications, you can pick up some of those differences. If you look at the aflatoxin component after drying and after storage, we did see a reduction in aflatoxin when we dried on a tarp and then sealed and then stored in a sealed bag. And then after 4 months of storage, not much difference. We just didn't have a huge increase. Now, this was northern Ghana in 2015 and 2016. They have one distinct season like you would have here in Malawi. So at least in this particular instance, initially we thought we'd have huge amounts of aflatoxin, but in those particular years in the northern part of Ghana, we didn't. Now, the data I showed you a minute ago for southern Ghana, we had huge amounts. That's one reason why you do work in both areas or multiple areas at during multiple years.